The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from World Tales by Idries Shah. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Catherine's Fate. If I were to be asked, what are world tales actually about? The answer would have to be, they are about fate or destiny. Some cover a long life, some only a few incidents from a career. Some are supposed to be about the lives of real people. Others purport to cover happenings, which can still be called fate, in the lives of mythical creatures. Fairies and superstitions are instruments of fate too. The fairy godmother alters fate, and the rabbit's foot is carried in the hope that it will cause a favourable fate. Fairy tales are often imagined to be so named because they feature gentle, feminine apparitions with gauzy wings. This is only a recent idea. The word fairy comes from the Latin fata, or fate, which became enchantment in French. So fate and magic are always associated in traditional tales, and the kind of fairy found in modern Western storybooks, usually for children, is only one form of this concretized fate. In this tale, found in Sicily and known in the Far East as well, Catherine's fate takes a more direct and positive form, as an imposing woman. In Greek and Roman times there were believed to be 3 fates, which arbitrarily controlled every person's life. Of these, lachesis measured the thread of life, and the special thread which features in this story may indicate an improvement in life and eventual happiness bestowed by lachesis. There once lived a very rich and generous merchant who had a gorgeous palace. The pride of his life was his daughter, a beautiful creature called Catherine. Catherine was tall and slim, with black hair and large lustrous eyes. Her hands and feet were small and delicate, her skin as soft as the petals of a rose. In the palace there were thrones of gold, chairs of silver set with precious turquoises, picture frames set with rubies, water jugs set with diamonds. All around her was luxury and beauty. Peacocks strolled in the gardens. Flowers bloomed in pots hanging from the trees. All was the best that money could buy. One day, when Catherine was walking in the garden, dressed in long silken robes sewn with the finest pearls and a cap with tassels of pearls, a very elegant-looking lady appeared before her. There was an extraordinary look about this lady. Her eyes were very penetrating and dark. Her clothes did not seem to be anything but luminous draperies. "Catherine, my dear child," said the lady, "what would you rather have? Would you like to enjoy life in your youth, or would you like to enjoy it in your old age? You have only these 2 choices." Catherine thought for a moment, and then she said, "If I have my enjoyment now, will I suffer for it in my last years?" And the tall lady said, "Yes." "But how do you know?" asked Catherine, still pondering the question. "I am your fate," answered the apparition. "Oh, then I will have my good fortune in my old age," said Catherine. "Very well, so be it," said her fate, and vanished. Catherine thought nothing of this encounter, and returned to the house to change her clothes for something even finer. But a few days later, terrible things began to happen. There was a great storm at sea. Catherine's father had expected his ships to return from a foreign country, loaded with rich cargoes, and they were all sent by the tempest to the bottom of the sea. His warehouses were gutted by a mysterious fire, so when he decided to refit new ships, there was nothing to put in them. He hired his ships to a duke who wanted to go to war with another prince, and all the ships were sunk in an engagement with pirates. The duke's men were put to the sword, and he, too, was penniless. Thieves broke in and stole all Catherine's jewels. Her clothes had to be sold to keep them in food a little longer. At last, wretched and ill, Catherine's father died, leaving her alone in the world. Penniless and in very simple garments, Catherine decided to leave this unlucky city and find some work, if possible, in another place. So she said farewell to the city of her birth and trudged off. She eventually reached a noble city far from her own country, and was standing in the street, wondering which way to go. She only had a little money, given to her by an old nurse, and was wondering where she could buy a piece of bread. A lady of quality, looking out of her window, saw her and called out, "Who are you, my dear, and where do you come from? You are not from this part of the land." "Lady, I am all alone in the world, as my father, who was once a rich merchant, has died, and I am looking for somewhere to buy a piece of bread," she said. "Come into my house. I need a servant, and you will do very well," said the noblewoman, and Catherine went gratefully into the big house. The lady became very fond of Catherine and trusted her with all the things she possessed. One day the mistress said to her, "I have to go out for a little while. Lock the door behind me and let no one either in or out until I return." So Catherine locked the door and sat down by the fire. No sooner had the noblewoman gone than the door flew open and her fate entered. "So here you are, Catherine," cried her fate harshly. "You have found yourself a very nice place here, haven't you? Well, you can't escape me like that, you know." And she began to throw the mistress's valuables all over the floor, breaking glass and china and tearing priceless linen to pieces. "Oh, no, no, no," cried Catherine. "I shall get into the most dreadful trouble. The lady trusts me." "Oh, does she?" sneered her fate. "Well, explain this to her when she comes back, then." And she ripped the long silken curtains to tatters. Catherine put her hands to her face and ran from the house, never looking back in case her fate was following. No sooner had she gone than her fate put everything back exactly as it had been before and disappeared. When the lady came back, the house was perfectly tidy, but Catherine was gone. The mistress called and called, but of course the poor girl did not hear, for she was far away. The lady looked everywhere, and thought perhaps Catherine had robbed her, but nothing was missing. She could not understand what could have happened. The girl had seemed to be perfectly reliable. Now poor Catherine ran on until she reached another city, and when looking for somewhere to buy a piece of bread, was noticed by another lady standing at her window. The lady opened the window and said to her, "Where are you from, and what are you doing in this place when so obviously you seem to be lost?" "I am a poor girl from far away, and I am looking for something to eat, as I am very hungry," said Catherine. "Well, come into my house," said the lady. "I will feed you and clothe you, and you may have a position in my household." So Catherine went in. But the very same thing happened as before. No sooner was she settled in the house and trusted with all the valuables than her fate appeared and created chaos in a few seconds. "Do you think that there was anywhere in this world I would not be able to find you?" cried her fate harshly, sweeping a line of priceless scent bottles to the ground and smashing them to smithereens. Catherine put her hands to her face and ran. and so it went on for the space of 7 years. Each time Catherine was taken on by some nice lady, the appearance of her fate caused her to travel on and on, endlessly it seemed to her, but she never escaped for long. But, and this Catherine did not know, her fate always restored everything to its former state the minute Catherine had disappeared. Now 7 years passed in this manner, and when Catherine was working for a very noble lady with a very kind heart, it was almost as if Catherine's fate had forgotten about her. Day after day, Catherine looked after the house, and things were always right for her. The tension was very great, though, for every hour she expected the door to fly open and her fate to appear. Each day she had to go up the mountain with a basket of the finest bread and cheese for her mistress. A tall, dignified personage took the bread from her gracefully each day, and after bowing, disappeared into a cave. One day her mistress told her, "I always have to propitiate my fate in this way. If that fresh bread and cheese were not sent to her, I shudder to think what she might cause to happen to me." At this, Catherine began to weep, unable to hide her grief, for she had suffered so much in the last 7 years that she could no longer hide her sadness. "My dear child, what is the matter with you? Tell me at once," cried the kind-hearted mistress, placing her hand on Catherine's shoulder. So Catherine told her the story of her fate's cruelty, and continued, "I do not think that I can stand any more of this anguish, expecting her to appear any moment and to tear everything to pieces, as she has done so often. In fact, I would like to go away from here soon, so that I do not bring my fate's destruction upon this house." "Now let me think of a plan," said the noblewoman, striking her forehead. "Yes, I have it. When you go up the mountain with my fate's bread, tell her your story and appeal to her to have a word with your fate, that she leaves off tormenting you like this. I am sure my fate, who is kind, will help." So next day, when Catherine went up to the mountain with the bread for her mistress's fate, she asked her to intercede with her own fate. "Well, your fate is asleep under 7 quilts just now," said the lady's fate. "But when you come tomorrow she might be awake, and I will take you to her." Catherine went away full of hope, and slept that night quite peacefully. When she took the bread up the mountain next morning, her mistress's fate took her to her own fate, who lay in a large bed, covered to the eyes with 7 feather quilts. "Now, sister, here is Catherine," said the fate of the noblewoman. "Leave off tormenting her so. I beg you to give her a little rest now." Her fate said nothing but, "Here is a skein of silk. Look after it carefully. It will be of great use to you. Now leave me to rest." And she pulled the quilts over her head. Puzzled by this, Catherine went home. Her mistress was all agog to know what had happened, but could not make head nor tail of the story Catherine told her. "The silk is worth scarcely anything," she said, "but you had better keep it. It might be of some use, as your fate said." The king of that country, who was young and extremely handsome, was to marry, and there was much consternation at the royal tailors when it was discovered that no silk of the right colour to sew the king's wedding robe together was to be found in the entire kingdom. "Issue a proclamation," said the king. "I must have my robes done in time. Send to the 4 countries bordering my land. Send to every quarter of my dominions. Whoever has silk of this colour must bring it to court, and I shall reward the owner of the silk generously." The noblewoman heard the proclamation and came to tell Catherine, "Catherine, my child, put on this dress and take your skein to the court. It is exactly the colour the king's tailor is looking for," she cried excitedly. "You will be rewarded most generously, I am sure." When Catherine appeared at the court before the throne, the young king found her so beautiful to look upon that he could not take his eyes off her face. "Your Majesty," said she, "will this silk be suitable for your wedding robe?" "You shall be paid in pure gold for it," said the king. "Bring the scales, and we will weigh the skein. Whatever it weighs, you shall have the equivalent in the finest gold of my realm." They brought the scales, but no matter how much gold was put upon the scales, the skein was always heavier. Then the king had larger scales brought, and threw all his treasure onto the scales, and still the skein weighed more. Then, in extreme exasperation, the king took the crown from his head and put it on the scales. At that very second the scales balanced, and the king laughed. "Where did you get this silk, my dear?" he asked Catherine. "From my mistress," said Catherine, and the king shouted, "Impossible! What sort of lady is your mistress that she has magic silk like this?" Then Catherine told all that had happened to her to the king, and he took her hand in his. "I will marry you instead of the girl to whom I have been betrothed," he said, and so it happened. Afterwards Catherine, who had suffered so much in her youth, lived to be a very old woman, and was happy until the moment of her death as queen of that far country. The Desolate Island. About the first half of the 7th century was written a spiritual romance, supposedly about Balaam and Josaphat, by a monk named John of Damascus. It was not until many centuries later that it was realized that most of the material in this book related to the life of the Buddha, and not to any Christian saint. The 10th parable in the work is also found in the Talmud, and employed there to encourage good and thoughtful deeds. Its substance was widely used by medieval monks to warn their hearers to prepare for the world to come, and it is also found in the oldest Spanish storybook, Count Lucanor, of the 14th century. This is the Talmudic parable of the desolate island, where the rich man is God, the slave is man, the island the world, the year of rain his lifespan, and the desolate island the future world. Scholars are of the opinion that the myth based on the Buddhist sources, which are still extant, was composed in pre-Islamic Egypt. There is also a literary and oral legend that the Caliph Harun al-Rashid carried out an experiment, placing a stranger, after drugging him, on the throne to test his worth, then drugging him again and returning him to his former place, because of his abuse of power. In a Sufi parable, a master hypnotizes a self-styled godly man, places him on a throne, reveals that he is really greedy, and restores him to his pauperhood, saying to the king and disciples, for whom the demonstration is performed, "This is not our man." The phrase has accordingly become a proverb in the Middle East. There was once a very wealthy man who was of a kind and generous disposition, and who wanted to make his slave happy. He therefore gave him his freedom, and also presented him with a shipload of merchandise. "Go," he said, "and sail to various countries, dispose of these goods, and whatever you may get for them shall be your own." The freed slave sailed away across the wide ocean. He had not been long on his voyage before a storm blew up. His ship was driven onto the rocks and went to pieces, and all on board were lost except the former slave himself. He managed to swim to a nearby island and drag himself ashore. Sad, despondent, and lonely, naked and with nothing to his name, he walked across the land until he came to a large and beautiful city. Many people came out to meet him, crying, "Welcome, welcome, long live our king!" They brought a rich carriage and, placing him in it, escorted him to a magnificent palace, where many servants gathered around him. He was dressed in royal garments, and they addressed him as their sovereign. They expressed their complete obedience to his will. The ex-slave was, naturally enough, amazed and confused, wondering whether he was dreaming, and all that he saw, heard, or experienced was merely passing fantasy. Eventually he became convinced that what was happening was in fact real, and he asked some people around him, whom he liked, how he could have arrived in this state. "I am, after all," he said, "a man of whom you know nothing, a poor, naked wanderer whom you have never seen before. How can you make me your ruler? This causes me more amazement than I can possibly say." "Sire," they answered, "this island is inhabited by spirits. Long ago they prayed that they might be sent a son of man to rule over them, and their prayers have been answered. Every year they are sent a son of man. They receive him with great dignity and place him on the throne. But his status and his power end when the year is over. Then they take the royal robes from him and put him on board a ship, which carries him to a vast and desolate island. Here, unless he has previously been wise and prepared for that day, he finds neither subject nor friend, and he is obliged to pass a weary, lonely, and miserable life. Then a new king is selected, and so year follows year. The kings who came before you were careless and did not think. They enjoyed their power to the full, forgetting the day when it would end." These people counseled the former slave to be wise and to allow their words to stay within his heart. The new king listened carefully to all this, and he felt grieved that he should have wasted even the little time which had passed since he came to the island. He asked a man of knowledge who had already spoken, "Advise me, O Spirit of wisdom, how I may prepare for the days which will come upon me in the future." "Naked you came among us," said the man, "and naked you shall be sent to the desolate island of which I have told you. At present you are king, and may do whatever you please. Therefore send workmen to the island, and let them build houses and prepare the land, and make the surroundings beautiful. The barren soil will be turned into fruitful fields. People will go there to live, and you will have established a new kingdom for yourself. Your own subjects will be waiting to welcome you when you arrive. The year is short, the work is long, therefore be earnest and energetic." The king followed this advice. He sent workmen and materials to the desolate island, and before the end of his term of power, it had become a fertile, pleasant, and attractive place. The rulers who had come before him had anticipated the end of their time with fear, or smothered the thought of it by amusing themselves. But he looked forward to it with joy, for then he could start upon a career of permanent peace and happiness. And the day came. The freed slave who had been made a king was stripped of his authority. With his royal robes he lost his powers. He was placed naked on a ship, and its sails were set for the island. When he approached its shore, however, the people whom he had sent ahead came forward to welcome him with music, song, and great joy. They made him ruler, and he lived ever after in peace. Gazelle Horn. The Hindu and Buddhist scriptures and tale collections contain many stories which are substantially similar to variants known all over the world. Among these ancient writings are the Hindu Mahabharata and Ramayana, and the Tibetan Buddhist Kagyur and Tangyur, which have influenced peoples of the Far East with tales which have not diffused westwards. Gazelle Horn is one of the best-known examples of this. Some idea of the importance of these books is seen in the fact that one collection of the Kagyur was bartered by a Buryat community for 7,000 oxen, even though, as the Russian authority Vasilev notes, People listen to the recitations and are edified even though they do not comprehend, since they do not understand Tibetan. The Kagyur is a translation from Sanskrit sources, made in Tibet between the 7th and 13th centuries, but mostly in the 9th. Its contents were analysed by the Hungarian pioneering scholar Xoma Korosi in Calcutta from a 100-volume edition. This version is, however, taken from the 108-volume edition printed in Peking in the 18th century by command of the emperor, and translated by Professor Anton von Schiffner, the specialist in Buddhist legends. In very remote times, in a forest region free from villages and richly provided with flowers, fruits, water, and roots, there lived a penance-performing holy man, a rishi. He fed on roots, fruit, and water, and clothed himself with leaves and skins. As he had attained the 5 kinds of insight, wild gazelles were in the habit of living in his hermitage and keeping him company. One day, a gazelle doe came to the spot where he had lately been, and as the results of human actions are beyond mental comprehension, it happened that she became pregnant. When the time came for her to bring forth, she went back to the same place and there gave birth to a boy. When she had smelt him and realized that this was a creature that did not resemble herself, she was terrified and abandoned him. Now the rishi came to the place and saw the child. He began to consider whose it might be, and he perceived that it was his own child. So he took the baby with him into his hermitage and brought it up there. When the boy had grown, gazelle horns appeared on his head, and because of this the rishi named him Gazelle Horn. The rishi fell ill, and although treated with the right medicines, his sickness did not become less. Seeing that he must die soon, he spoke to the boy thus: "O son, from time to time many rishis come to this hermitage from all manner of regions. You must, from love of me, receive them in a friendly manner, invite them to repose on your couch, and set before them roots and fruits according to your means." It is said that the end of collection is diffusion, the end of the high is to fall, the end of coming together is separation, and the end of life is death. So the holy man discharged his obligations to this law. The youth burnt the rishi's body in the usual manner, and then, as he mourned, being depressed by grief at the loss of his father, he found himself possessed of the 5 kinds of insight. One day, when he had gone to fetch water in a pitcher, the deity began to let rain fall. As he walked along with the container, which was quite full, he let it fall so that it broke. Rishis are very quickly angered, so spilling the little water that was left, he reproached the deity, saying, "As my full pitcher has been broken because of your bad behavior, you shall not let rain fall for 12 years from this day." Because of this curse, the deity let no rain fall. In consequence, a great famine arose in Varanasi, and its people consequently emigrated in all directions. The king sent for the seers, and said to them, "Honored sirs, to whose power is it due that the deity sends no rain?" They replied, "To a rishi's anger. If he can be disturbed in his penances, the deity will again send rain. Otherwise it is not possible." The king sat absorbed in thought. His wives, the princes, and the ministers asked him, "Why, O king, are you displeased?" He replied, "On account of a rishi's anger, the deity sends no rain. The seers have declared that if the rishi can be disturbed in his penances, the deity will send rain again, but that otherwise it is impossible." One of the king's daughters, whose name was Shanta, said, "O king, if that is the case, do not be distressed. I will contrive that the rishi shall be completely distracted from this penance." The king said, "By what means?" She replied, "Let me and other women be taught mystic lore by the Brahmins, members of the priestly caste, and let a hermitage, provided with flowers, fruit, and water, be prepared on a ferry boat." The king agreed. Then the princess gave orders for the preparation of tempting objects, and fruits filled with wine, and other very bright fruits of various kinds. She made herself look like a rishi, dressed herself in bark and grass, and went to the gazelle-horn rishi's hermitage, attended by the women to whom the Brahmins had taught mystic lore. When they arrived, the pupils of the gazelle-horn rishi said to him, "O teacher, many rishis have come to the hermitage." He replied, "It is well that rishis have come. Bring them in." When they had entered and he had looked at them, he said in verse, "Alas, a rishi's appearance was never like this of old. A loosely flowing step, a face free from beard, a rising and falling breast." His mind was a prey to doubt, but he offered his visitors roots and fruit. They ate, and then said to the rishi, "Your fruits are harsh and acid. The fruits which are to be found at our hermitage on the water are like the drink of the gods. Therefore we invite you there." He went with them to the pleasure ground on board the boat. There they spread before him stupefying substances, coconuts filled with wine, and other fruits. When he was drunk with wine and seduced by the alluring things, he gave himself up to pleasure with the women, and his magical power vanished. The deity, rejoicing in rain, called the clouds together from every side and got the better of the rishi. Shanta said, "Now, do you know what the power is?" Having fettered the rishi with amorous bonds, she took him to the king and said, "O king, this is the man." As the deity now sent rain, a good harvest followed. The king gave Shanta to the rishi as his wife, together with her attendants. But the rishi, ignoring her, began to indulge in love with other women. She also started to treat him with small respect, as her good nature was destroyed by jealousy. One day, when she hit him on the head with a shoe during an argument, he said to himself, "I, who used not to allow power to the thunder of the cloud, must now, being fettered by love bonds, allow myself to be set at naught by a woman." Thereupon he again devoted himself to ascetic exertions, and once more became possessed of the 5 kinds of insight. This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.